over this last 10-year period of time, you've seen rising political violence in the United States. The most egregious instances of this have been on the right, to be sure, but we're going through an era of what I call the era of violent populism in the United States. That era is first and foremost occurring now and not 20 years ago and so forth. It's not occurring, in my view, mainly because of social media, although that is like pouring gasoline on a fire. It's not mainly occurring because of polarization, although political polarization here and gerrymandering of our districts is, again, another gasoline on a fire. It's occurring because we're going through a demographic transition. The United States is transitioning from a white majority democracy to a genuinely multiracial democracy, and that transition is happening during our generation, our time. In 1990, 80% of the American public was white. Today, and that had been true going way back, that, even though there's changes, that had not changed a whole lot in our history. Today, that's 61%. In just 10 years, 2035, it could be 51, 52% or even less. That transition to the world's first large, genuinely multiracial democracy, that's happening now in our lifetime. That accounts for why the rise of Donald Trump happened when it happened. And so a lot of Donald Trump's rhetoric we've actually heard before. You can go back to the 1960s. You can find instances of this. Pape Buchanan in the early 90s. So the words out of Trump's mouth are not always truly unique. What's unique is the takers. What's unique is the large support that those words are receiving. Now, maybe he's slightly more charismatic than Pape Buchanan or some of the folks in the 60s, but I think it's not that. I think what really explains the why now, and why the large amount of anger is because as America goes through this demographic transition to a large multiracial democracy from a white majority democracy, so we don't start multiracial, see, we're going through this transition, there's a large part of the country that wants to stop or even deport people to reverse that transition. But you also then have on the left a large number of people that want to continue or maybe even accelerate the transition. And a lot of folks on the left see the rise of Donald Trump and they want to accelerate even more, you see. So you get into a situation where once now you have this populist Trump gaining all this support, this starts to produce counter reactions in our body politic. And that is, I think, what accounts for this era of violent populism. Why still the lion's share of the blame or the energy is coming from the right. I'm not really challenging that. But we also need to see that it's also spreading. And we have 10 more years before that we really get to a white minority democracy. And so this period of time could be quite volatile. Other countries, mature democracies, Western democracies, are also going through demographic transitions, a little bit later paced than the United States. So Canada is an example, France is an example, Germany is an example, Britain is an example. So if you get out the Wikipedia pages on demographic changes in all those countries, you will see curves and everything, and you'll see the details will be different. But nonetheless, you will see a consistent pattern of this white majority is now becoming a minority. Again, the dates of the transition points are different, and they're later than the United States. But it's why the United States, in many ways, the United States became the first world's truly genuine democracy, even at that point in time in 76 or so forth. Only 5% of American adults could vote, so we still call it a democracy. But now we're going through and leading the world as transitioning from that white majority to a multiracial democracy. And that is producing stress, and it's producing a lot of stress in our politics. And that's the overall environment in which we are living, and why it's so difficult to keep looking, well, if we just had a different rule about Meta, if we just simply controlled Meta. Right. Or let's say that the problem here, if you listen to the right, it was Twitter was too liberal. Well, Elon Musk just bought Twitter and fired 70% of the people. Notice that doesn't seem to really be calming anything down. Or the problem is Tucker Carlson. Oh, we just need to deplatform Tucker Carlson, or we just need to deplatform Trump. Well, notice all those things have happened, and what has happened is we've become even more volatile, more intense as time goes on. And so it's because those are accelerants, those are issues, but the macro issue that's occurring is this demographic change, and it's occurring really without, we don't have like this great historical guide for how to navigate that, and I think that we are slowly coming to grips that this really is a pretty big issue.
And I think this phenomenon, this macro phenomenon you're talking about, is deeply intertwined with election denialism.
Oh,
where
sure.
Republicans think that, in particular, it's the votes of people of color, people in Democrat cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee. These are the votes that should be discounted. Non-citizens, well, we know non-citizens aren't really voting, but they're quite convinced that they are.
So this lens of demographic change from white majority democracy to multiracial democracy, and we're going through the transition generation now, really helps to explain why election denialism is so important, and also immigration. But let's focus on just election denialism. So if there's a transition from a white majority democracy to a white minority democracy, well, then what that means is that parties have to make decisions. They have to decide, how are they going to respond to that? Well, the Democratic Party has been quite clearly a party where they have been absorbing. In fact, many people think the Democratic Party is too much of a big tent. So it's always pretty much always been a big tent for at least our lifetimes. And so for the Democratic Party, there's not really that much of a decision. They're just going with what they have done for many generations. The Republican Party is a different story. And the real inflection point came with Donald Trump, because Jeb Bush, who was pushing for a different kind of Republican Party. This was a Republican Party that was going to be, under Jeb Bush, much more open to especially Hispanic, but all minorities. So Jeb Bush was pushing for a Republican Party that would be a multiracial Republican Party. Donald Trump, not so much. And if you look at the nature of the it is a mix. The Republican Party is not 100% white, but it's very heavily white. And it is the case that even Donald Trump has been reaching out to minorities, but it's very much, who's in charge is pretty clear here, and the minorities need to assimilate to that culture defined by Trump and by other of the, let's call them the traditional Republicans. And so what you're seeing is that under those circumstances, when they lose elections, here, there can be a real problem here if it's just the course of history. So if what's happening is you want to keep an image of a party that is not a genuinely multiracial party where whites are a minority, even in the Republican Party, that would be the Jeb Bush vision of the world, or the Nikki Haley vision of the world. If that's not your vision of the Republican Party, and it's that alternative Donald Trump vision, then then you really are losing your odds of winning each election over time get smaller and smaller, because whites are declining as a percentage of the population in each year. And then if we look inside the different generations of whites, the baby boomer generation of whites, who are now the oldest generation in the United States, they are the most heavily white generation in the United States. So each year that you have the passing of the baby boomers, they're being replaced by a much, much more multiracial population. You see what I mean? So what that says is keeping that that vision, the Trump vision of the Republican Party, it just gets harder and harder and harder every year to win, which means you got to prepare for election denialism, which is what Trump has been doing.
Yeah.
You see, so I don't think these are lost on Trump. I've never had a conversation with him. I don't know, but his commitment to, let's call it early preemptive election denialism, it makes sense from this perspective that the more each passing year goes on, and the more the United States transitions to that multiracial democracy, that makes it just increasingly harder for the Trump vision of the Republican Party to win. But nonetheless, that's where we are, and that's why Trump has been so, I think the Trump phenomenon has been wedded to the phenomenon of Republican election denialism.